Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. My parents skipped my white coat ceremony because my younger brother wanted one last family vacation before college. They promised we'd celebrate later and acted like missing one of the biggest days of my life wasn't a big deal. They had no idea that one unexpected moment, led by the dean of my medical school, would expose who truly believed in me and who never had. Stick with me, because this story only gets crazier from here. My name is Brenna Hale, and for as long as I can remember, I lived in my brother Cade's shadow. Every birthday, every family gathering, and every achievement somehow turned into a celebration of him. If Cade succeeded, everyone cheered. If I succeeded, I was simply doing what was expected. I kept convincing myself that becoming a doctor would finally earn my parents' respect. The white coat ceremony was supposed to be that moment. I saved 2 seats for my mom and dad, imagining how proud they'd look watching me take my first step toward becoming a physician. But 2 days before the ceremony, they called and casually said they couldn't come because Cade's friends had planned a vacation, and they didn't want him to miss out on making memories before college. They told me we'd celebrate another time. I stood there alone during one of the most important moments of my life, believing the empty seats behind me were the hardest part of my story. I couldn't have been more wrong. The empty seats my parents were supposed to fill stayed in my mind long after the white coat ceremony ended. Looking at them reminded me that this wasn't just one painful decision. It was the story of my entire childhood. Cade's baseball games were treated like championship events, while my science fairs, honor ceremonies, and academic awards were barely worth mentioning. If 2 events happened on the same day, my parents never had to think about where they were going. They always chose Cade, and I learned to stop expecting anything different. Whenever Cade got into trouble, there was always an excuse. He was stressed, tired, or just figuring life out. But when I succeeded, my parents acted as if good grades and scholarships were simply what I was supposed to do. They rarely celebrated my accomplishments because, according to them, I had always been the responsible one. Somehow, doing everything right made me easier to overlook. Medical school wasn't easy. I earned scholarships, worked night shifts, and stretched every dollar just to keep going. There were nights when I barely slept before heading back to class, but I never complained. Even then, my parents insisted Cade needed more financial and emotional support because he was still finding himself. After the ceremony, professors congratulated me, classmates hugged me, and strangers celebrated my achievement with genuine pride. I smiled, thanked everyone, and pretended I had accepted my parents' absence. I told myself I didn't need their approval anymore. But the truth was harder to admit. Deep inside, the little girl who kept hoping her mom and dad would finally notice her was still waiting, wondering what it would take to be enough. About a week after my white coat ceremony, my parents invited the whole family over for dinner. At first, I thought maybe they wanted to make up for missing such an important milestone. A small part of me still hoped they would apologize or at least ask how the ceremony had gone. Instead, I walked into a house filled with excitement for Cade. He had recently started working on a new business venture, and my parents acted as if he had already built $1 million company. Throughout dinner, the conversation never stayed on me for more than a few seconds. My mother briefly mentioned my white coat ceremony, describing it as a nice little school event. My father laughed and said there would be plenty of graduations in the future, so missing one wasn't a big deal. Their words stung, but I stayed quiet. There was no point arguing with people who had already convinced themselves they had done nothing wrong. Before dessert was served, instead of wasting my energy arguing with my parents, I made a decision that changed my life. If they were never going to see my worth, I would stop trying to convince them. I threw myself completely into medical school, focusing on the one dream that had carried me through years of disappointment. Every lecture, every clinical rotation, and every challenge became another step toward the future I wanted to build for myself. Life wasn't easy. My days started before sunrise and often ended long after midnight. Between exhausting hospital shifts, endless textbooks, practical exams, and constant studying, there were weeks when I barely had time to eat a proper meal. I survived on coffee, determination, and the belief that every sacrifice would eventually be worth it. Whenever I felt like giving up, I reminded myself why I had started this journey in the first place. During those difficult months, one person quietly began paying attention. Dean Maris Quinn had a reputation for noticing students who worked hard without asking for recognition. She regularly checked on students facing financial struggles or personal hardships, making sure no one felt completely alone. Unlike many people, she never judged anyone by their background or family connections. She cared about effort, resilience, and character. One afternoon, after a long shift at the hospital, she asked me to stop by her office. She told me she had watched my progress and believed I had the potential to become more than just a good physician. She encouraged me to apply for one of the school's most prestigious leadership fellowships, a program so competitive that most first-year students never even considered it. I thanked her for believing in me, filled out the application, and submitted it without expecting anything to happen. After all, disappointment had taught me not to expect good news too soon. A few months passed, and life settled into a demanding routine of classes, hospital rotations, and long nights of studying. Then one evening, my parents invited me over for what they called important family news. The moment I walked in, I saw balloons, flowers, and smiling faces. Cade stood in the middle of the room, proudly announcing that he was engaged. Everyone cheered while my parents immediately shifted into planning mode, talking about venues, decorations, catering, and the kind of wedding that would impress everyone they knew. I was genuinely happy for Cade. I congratulated him and wished him and his fiancée nothing but the best. But before dinner was even over, the conversation turned toward me. My father smiled and said that since I was becoming a doctor, I should help cover some of the wedding expenses. My mother quickly added that family always supports family and that this was my chance to show how much I cared. I took a deep breath and explained as calmly as I could that I simply couldn't afford it. Between tuition, rent, books, and student loans, every dollar I earned from my hospital shifts already had a purpose. I wasn't refusing because I didn't love my brother. I genuinely didn't have the money they assumed I did. The room grew quiet for only a second before my mother's expression hardened. She accused me of changing since entering medical school. She said wearing a white coat had made me arrogant and that I thought I was better than the rest of the family. Her words stung because they couldn't have been further from the truth. I quietly stood up, wished Cade well again, and walked out. Driving home, I finally accepted something I'd avoided admitting for years. My parents only appreciated the version of me that kept giving without asking for understanding, respect, or support in return. They had never truly taken the time to know the real me. A few days after the uncomfortable dinner with my family, I received an email from Dean Maris Quinn asking me to stop by her office whenever I had time. I assumed it was about classes or the leadership fellowship application, so I finished my hospital shift and headed over without thinking much about it. When I walked in, she greeted me with a warm smile and asked me to have a seat. After a brief conversation, she shared something I had never known. Years earlier, several faculty members had quietly created an emergency fund to help medical students facing financial hardship. No one talked about it publicly because they wanted students to accept help without feeling embarrassed or judged. She explained that many generous donors believed in supporting hardworking students who refused to give up despite difficult circumstances. Then she looked directly at me and said something I never expected to hear. She told me my determination, work ethic, and refusal to let personal setbacks define my future had deeply impressed not only the faculty but also many of those donors. According to her, after hearing about my journey, they had decided to establish a new scholarship that would support future first-generation medical students who faced similar struggles. They wanted the scholarship to carry my name as a reminder that perseverance could change lives. For a moment, I couldn't find the words to respond. I had spent years feeling invisible in my own family, yet people who barely knew me believed my story could inspire others. Dean Quinn then asked if I would be comfortable allowing my journey to be shared during the hospital's annual donor gala. She believed it would encourage future students and honor the people who made the scholarship possible. I gratefully agreed, never imagining that my parents had also received invitations through Kate's growing business connections. I had no idea our paths were about to cross again. The evening of the hospital's annual donor gala finally arrived, and the ballroom was filled with some of the most respected people in the medical community. Physicians, hospital executives, generous donors, researchers, and local community leaders gathered to celebrate education, patient care, and the future of medicine. I felt honored just to be invited and reminded myself that I was there because someone believed my journey mattered. After checking in, I greeted a few professors and classmates before finding my assigned table. The atmosphere was elegant but welcoming, with conversations about medicine, research, and the lives that scholarships had helped change. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. A few minutes later, I noticed my parents and Kate walking into the ballroom. They hadn't come because of me. Kate had recently started building business connections, and he hoped the event would introduce him to wealthy investors and influential professionals. My parents stayed close to him, proudly introducing him to anyone willing to listen. When someone asked about me, my mother simply smiled and said, "Oh, that's our daughter. She's still in medical school." Those few words hurt more than I expected. After everything I'd worked for, I was still reduced to a passing comment while Kate remained the center of attention. They didn't mention my scholarships, my hospital work, or the reason I had been invited in the first place. I considered confronting them, but I stopped myself. This night wasn't about proving anything to my family. It was about celebrating the people who had invested in students like me. As I looked across the room, Dean Maris Quinn caught my eye and offered a reassuring smile. It was calm, confident, and almost knowing. Moments later, the lights dimmed, the conversations faded, and the evening's program was about to begin. I had no idea everything was about to change. The evening continued with speeches recognizing generous donors and celebrating the hospital's mission. I listened quietly, expecting to applaud the award recipients and head home afterward. Nothing about the program suggested that I would be part of it, so I sat comfortably, enjoying the inspiring stories being shared. About halfway through the ceremony, Dean Maris Quinn walked onto the stage again. The room became silent as everyone expected her to introduce another major donor. Instead, she paused for a moment, smiled toward my table, and called my name. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood. People around me turned and began applauding as Dean Quinn motioned for me to come forward. My heart raced while I made my way to the stage, completely unaware of what was happening. Once I stood beside her, Dean Quinn began speaking about determination, resilience, and the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed. She shared how I had worked overnight hospital shifts to support myself while keeping up with one of the most demanding medical programs in the country. She spoke about the scholarships I had earned through hard work, the obstacles I had faced without complaint, and my commitment to serving patients despite every challenge life had placed in my path. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Dean Quinn proudly revealed that I had been selected as the youngest recipient in the hospital's history to receive the prestigious Physician Leadership Fellowship. The award included full tuition support for the remainder of my medical education, guaranteed residency placement after graduation, and leadership opportunities that most students could only dream about. The ballroom erupted into applause as doctors, donors, and hospital leaders rose to their feet. I stood there overwhelmed, struggling to process what I had just heard. When I looked toward my family's table, my parents and Kate sat frozen in their seats, staring at me in complete disbelief. For the first time in my life, they were seeing me through everyone else's eyes. The applause continued far longer than I expected. One by one, hospital executives, senior surgeons, department chairs, and respected physicians came forward to shake my hand and congratulate me. Several donors introduced themselves, telling me they admired my determination and believed I had a bright future in medicine. It felt surreal standing among people I had looked up to for years, hearing them speak about my hard work with such genuine respect. As I thanked everyone, I couldn't help glancing toward my family's table. Unlike everyone else in the room, they hadn't moved. My parents sat completely still, their expressions frozen somewhere between shock and confusion. It was as if they were looking at a stranger instead of the daughter they had raised. They had spent years overlooking my accomplishments, and now they were watching an entire ballroom celebrate achievements they barely knew existed. Cade finally broke the silence. In a quiet voice, he asked our parents why no one had ever told him I was receiving such an important honor. My mother looked down at the table, unable to answer. My father opened his mouth but couldn't find the right words. The truth was painfully simple. There had never been a secret to keep. I hadn't hidden my life from them. They had simply never asked about it. They never called to ask how medical school was going, what I was working toward, or what challenges I faced. Every conversation eventually circled back to Cade, leaving little room for anything else. Watching them sit there in silence felt strangely different from all the arguments we'd had over the years. This silence carried the weight of every missed opportunity, every ignored accomplishment, and every moment they had chosen not to see me. For the first time, they weren't defending their choices or making excuses. They were forced to face the reality of everything they had missed. After the ceremony ended, guests slowly returned to their conversations while many people stopped to congratulate me one last time. I was still trying to process everything that had happened when Dean Maris Quinn gently asked if I had a few minutes to talk in private. We stepped into a quiet hallway away from the crowded ballroom, where the excitement of the evening faded into silence. Dean Quinn smiled warmly before thanking me for never giving up, even when life had made my journey far more difficult than most people realized. She said that achievements like mine weren't measured only by grades or awards but by the determination to keep moving forward despite disappointment. Then her expression softened, and she shared something she had never told me before. She said she still remembered my white coat ceremony months earlier. While everyone else was celebrating with their families, she had noticed 2 reserved seats that remained empty throughout the entire event. She remembered seeing me glance toward them more than once before forcing a smile and continuing with the ceremony. She knew exactly what those empty chairs meant without me saying a single word. What happened next completely caught me off guard. Dean Quinn explained that several faculty members had quietly moved into those empty seats before the official photographs were taken. They didn't want me to look back years later and remember only the absence of my parents. They hoped that when I saw those pictures, I would also remember that I wasn't truly alone that day. The moment those words sank in, I felt tears filling my eyes. I had believed no one noticed my heartbreak, yet strangers had quietly stepped in to protect me without expecting thanks or recognition. Meanwhile, my own parents had chosen a vacation over one of the most important milestones of my life. That realization hurt more than I could put into words, but it also reminded me that family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes, the people who stand beside you choose to be there. The days after the gala were quieter than I expected, but they didn't stay that way for long. My phone, which had often gone weeks without a call from my parents, suddenly started ringing almost every day. At first, I ignored the calls, assuming they wanted to talk about the event. Then the messages began. My mother asked if we could have dinner together as a family. My father suggested taking new family photographs to celebrate my achievement. They even talked about hosting another celebration because, in their words, they wanted to do it the right way this time. Reading those messages stirred emotions I wasn't prepared for. Part of me had spent years wishing for this kind of attention, yet now that it had finally arrived, it felt different. Their sudden interest only appeared after a room full of respected doctors and hospital leaders had recognized me. I couldn't stop wondering whether they truly saw me now or simply regretted how their choices had looked in front of everyone else. A few days later, Cade reached out and asked if we could meet. When we sat down together, he looked uncomfortable in a way I had never seen before. He admitted he had benefited from our parents' favoritism his entire life without fully realizing how much it had hurt me. He apologized for accepting their attention without questioning why I was always expected to stand aside. He said he had never intended to make me feel invisible. His apology sounded genuine, and for the first time, I believed he understood at least part of what I had lived through. My parents also insisted they had always loved and supported me, claiming they had simply made mistakes along the way. I listened to every word without interrupting. They all sounded sincere, but sincerity alone couldn't erase years of broken promises, missed milestones, and quiet heartbreak. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt in a single conversation. A few days later, I agreed to meet my parents one final time. We sat together in the same dining room where I had spent years hoping to earn their approval. This time, though, I wasn't there to argue or reopen old wounds. I simply wanted to say what had been sitting in my heart for far too long. My parents apologized again. They admitted they had made mistakes and asked if we could put everything behind us. My mother reached across the table and said she wanted us to be a close family again. My father promised things would be different from now on. I believed they regretted their choices, but regret alone couldn't erase years of feeling invisible. I calmly explained that forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. I was willing to let go of the anger because carrying it had only weighed me down. But trust had to be rebuilt through actions, not promises. It couldn't return overnight simply because they had finally recognized my achievements. I also told them something I had never been brave enough to say before. I wasn't angry because they loved Cade. I was hurt because they had spent so many years making me feel like I mattered less. Every missed milestone, every broken promise, and every comparison had left a mark that wouldn't disappear with one conversation. I wasn't looking for revenge, and I didn't want endless family arguments. I had spent too much of my life chasing people who only noticed me after the rest of the world had recognized my worth. I wasn't willing to live that way anymore. When I stood up to leave, no one stopped me. For the first time in my life, I walked away without guilt. I wasn't abandoning my family. I was finally choosing myself, and that decision gave me a sense of peace I had never known before. After graduating and beginning my residency, I discovered something I had never expected to find. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was instead of comparing me to someone else. The long hours were exhausting, and every day brought new challenges, but I never felt alone. My mentors pushed me to become a better physician because they believed in my potential, not because they expected perfection. The nurses treated me like part of the team, always willing to teach, encourage, and offer advice during difficult shifts. My fellow residents celebrated each other's successes without jealousy or competition. Whether someone completed a difficult procedure, passed an important exam, or simply survived another demanding week, we found reasons to encourage one another. It was a kind of support I had spent my entire life searching for. The greatest lessons often came from my patients. Their trust reminded me why I had chosen medicine in the first place. A simple thank you, a smile after good news, or knowing I had made someone's hardest day a little easier meant more than any award or title ever could. Dean Maris Quinn continued to check on me even after I started residency. She remained one of my strongest mentors, always reminding me that success wasn't measured only by accomplishments but also by the lives I touched along the way. One afternoon, after we shared coffee at the hospital, she told me something I would never forget. She said family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes it's built through respect, kindness, loyalty, and people who choose to stand beside you when they have nothing to gain. Looking around at my mentors, colleagues, nurses, and patients, I realized she was right. I hadn't lost everything when my parents failed me. Along the way, I had quietly built a new family, one that saw my worth long before I ever had to prove it. Several years passed faster than I ever imagined. Residency became a career, and the young student who had once stood alone at her white coat ceremony had grown into a confident physician. One morning, I received an invitation that brought back memories I thought I had left behind. My medical school had asked me to return as the keynote speaker for the newest class of students receiving their white coats. Without hesitation, I accepted. Walking back into the same auditorium felt surreal. Every corner reminded me of the day I had searched the audience for my parents and found only 2 empty seats. For years, that memory had been tied to disappointment, but now it no longer carried the same weight. I had built a life that wasn't defined by who failed to show up but by the people who believed in me along the way. As I stepped onto the stage, I looked across the audience and smiled. The seats were filled with proud families, supportive friends, mentors, and students excited to begin their journeys. I spoke about resilience, perseverance, and the importance of believing in yourself even when others don't. I hoped at least one student sitting there would remember those words during the difficult days ahead. Near the back of the auditorium, I noticed my parents quietly sitting together. They didn't try to draw attention to themselves. They simply listened and applauded with everyone else when my speech ended. There was sadness in their expressions, but also understanding. They finally realized the daughter they had overlooked had become exactly the woman they should have been proud of from the very beginning. As I walked off the stage, I felt no anger and no desire for revenge. I had already won the greatest victory. I no longer measured my worth by anyone else's approval. My story wasn't about being chosen by my family. It was about choosing myself, and that decision changed the course of my life forever.